So there's a story, a dominant story of the city that is more or less based on one group of the city. The kind of middle class, well-to-do, in this case, white inhabitants of the city. While at the same time, the realities of, in Detroit, even a majority of non-white people are not part of the dominant story of the city. So the breadlines of the unemployed in the poor suburbs of Detroit do not play a role in the dominant story of the city. So which creates more or less a perception on the side of the white elite who have probably all the best things in mind for their city, that say, yes, there's a problem with the colored neighborhoods. We will have to solve that problem, but we have to develop our city. That's the big story. But there's a problem. We have to we have to solve that problem. On the other hand, these people have brains and minds and ideas too. So they do not look at themselves like, okay, we have to take the city forward, city on the move. But there's a problem with us. We have to solve us. Of course, that's not the way they look. The way they see it is their city is not our city. They are only taking care for themselves. They're leaving us in the cold. Nobody is looking out for our city. We are not represented. If they get their way with this modernization, it will mean that we are out. They know that they think that they are the problem. So there's two groups, of which one is convinced that they are talking about the entire city, and the other group is convinced that they are not. In Broadwater Farm, what you see is more or less the same. What you see there is maybe not so much aimed at the city development, but it is aimed at justice. You can see that in the immediate aftermath of so it was not just rioters who are affected by the incidents of police of the police actions. I mean, it's still until this day unclear if it was police brutality or not that killed the lady that triggered the Broadwater Farm riots. But it is not just the it is not just the rioters who feel provoked and angered by this perceived police brutality, but also let's say the grandmothers in the area. And what you see in London and other British cities is also that the black people do not feel represented by the justice system. They feel that which also creates the perception that whenever a black kid is arrested for whatever he has done, immediately the black community has the tendency to believe that he is arrested innocently, whether that be the case or not, because they do not feel represented by the justice system. Inside LA, of course, the whole thing is about race, but the racial question in LA is even more complex and specific than anywhere else, because you can see that the racial question there have been books written about it about what they call the truly under. It's a book. I can't remember the title anymore. But anyway, there's a whole host of literature right now about that there's a certain type of poverty and a certain type of urban backwardness that is chronic. That there are certain communities and certain parts of communities that do not move out of it anymore, that do not integrate, that do not step out of the ghetto, but that the ghetto becomes so complex and so big that it does not offer any emergency exits anymore. And this became very clear in the Los Angeles riots when for example, in these types of maps that show that within the nearly entirely black area of South Central, the area itself was cut up into territories of the Crips versus the Bloods. So inside the entirely black zones, there was a kind of tribal warfare nearly going on for decades and decades between one group of black gangs against another group. And they kind of kept themselves active and lived on the basis of drug dealing and violence. So you can see here that there was a kind of a racial ghetto that had been left neglected for so long, and that had been underrepresented politically and had been segregated from the rest of the city for so long that it nearly had become a state within the state. Because it was a kind of no-go zone for the police, and the police didn't mind if they killed each other as long as they didn't start burning up Hollywood. So in that sense, the riots were perfectly understandable. If you look at the French riots, or the French role of race, you can see that the problem is that, of course, in the French political morality and the French political system, as in ours, but in the French even more explicitly, there can be no difference between any French citizen in the republican system. All French citizens are exactly that, French citizens. So there is hardly any room in the French discourse to make very specific, to talk about the fact that there are different cultures living next to each other in the suburbs. There isn't even room to talk about the suburbs in many circles. The French culture and French politics is reduced to its best elements. You could say the centers of the city, the republican ideals of politics, culture, literature, etc. But what happened with the riots is that all of a sudden this whole world all of a sudden appeared on the screen. And of course everybody knew that there were people of different ethnicities and races, but there was hardly any talk about that. Okay, now we move into, gradually we move into the territory where we should feel more at home. The first one is planning. I'm not sure where we are. I think we're at 8 or something. Step 8. 6 only. Wow. We're halfway there. Planning. What is the role of planning in laying the basis for rioting? This is another screenshot from the Detroit episode. Here you can see one of the city plan. Detroit was in an era where the American cities discovered planning. They discovered planning as a fantastic tool to achieve modernization. They took the tool from European influences that came in during and after the Second World War, and they turned it into their own thing, a fantastically ambitious, creative, and innovative period in planning. The Americans invent planning in the 50s and 60s in an enormously large-scale and optimistic way. And here the idea is, okay, this Detroit city has now existed as an industrial city for nearly 100 years, and now we are going to completely reshape it. We are going to reshape it so that it becomes a city for the 21st century. We are going to reshape it so that it does not become one big sprawling industrial suburb, but we are going to reshape it so that it becomes a logical, rational, hierarchic combination of urban neighborhoods where everything is in its right place. Every neighborhood has everything it needs. The neighborhoods are separated by highways and green parks, etc. So they take a model, what you could say of the modernist model of the city, developed more or less from the Garden City movement onward, and try to use this model, which is completely different from the reality that they are working with, and try to push it on this existing city of Detroit. So they take a theoretical, rational model of the city and push it on the existing Detroit, and cutting away like a combination of surgeons and demolitionists. They try to cut away all the parts that do not fit the model until they retroactively turn Detroit into the city that it could be instead of that it is. Here, for example, you see the idea to use to turn the whole city into a cluster of neighborhoods, all with public schools in the center of them, and all the middle parts could then be non-residential parks, highways, etc. Of course, in order to do this, entire areas have to be demolished to bring in the highways, creating these kinds of images. Even if this is a wrong image because it's from a European, it's from London in the 1940s, but anyway. You get the picture. Which brings me to London in London planning. London planning was not so much the idea of we have discovered planning, because London had planning for many years in the post-war period, but in London planning was necessitated by the Second World War. The Second World War, the bombings, the constant bombings of London, the Blitz, created an enormous amount of bombed out areas in the city, which then the whole challenge of reconstruction was not seen as a challenge of let's build it back like it was before, but it was taken as an opportunity to build this city right into the 21st century, and to use the availability of all this empty land to make a kind of a scale jump. So into these emptinesses of London, these spaceship-like elements were dropped. These enormous high-rise fortresses were dropped in order to give London the kind of planning optimism that otherwise it would not have had. Now we are talking about Los Angeles. In Los Angeles it is more difficult to understand the role of planning, because Los Angeles is so underplanned, you could say. But one of the big things, and this is just a suggestion, because you cannot really say that planning was one of the root causes or created one of the most dominant conditions for the conditions leading up to the riots. But one of the planning things, however, was the fact that while until the middle of the 20th century, I'm sorry, I can hear you whisper. No, you should. It's just that I want to hear what you're saying. It's my curiosity is working against my concentration. What did happen is that until the middle of until the middle of the 20th century, especially the south central area in Los Angeles, where the area between the center, downtown LA, and the sea, was extremely well connected and by a very intricate pattern of streetcars, of public transport. And this whole structure of public transport was then replaced by this. Or it was not replaced, this came, and then they stopped building out the streetcar system, and they stopped riding the streetcars. So instead of an intricate grid of public transport that made, even if you would live in a little house in the middle of Watts in the 1940s, and you could go immediately to the Hunter Douglas factories or to downtown, you could just step on it with your kids, etc., and go anywhere in the city, which was a very, very modern situation, Los Angeles in the 1930s and 40s. The whole city there was an overlay of the freeway system, which meant that the privileged classes could move much faster from the outlying suburbs into the central